welcome to today's Boss to Boss podcast. In our interviews, we feature remarkable people doing imaginative things in often unimaginative markets, usually from the world of B2B. Today, we're joined by Marcus Sheridan, international keynote speaker, digital marketing mastermind, and best-selling author of what Mashable described as the #1 book on marketing. Marcus, thank you so much for joining us.
Dan, great to be here. I think we're going to have a great conversation today.
I think so. So look, let's get straight to it. So I'd really like to ask a few questions about e-commerce in B2B, if that's okay, because it's something that I've spoken to a number of people about over the last couple of years. And I got to be honest, I'm not a total convert. I get it to a degree. I've seen some nice examples myself of where companies that maybe have historically specialized in service offerings have seen great benefit by productizing those offerings. But I just wonder, are there certain criteria that a B2B organization needs to satisfy in order to be in the right position to benefit from that shift into e-commerce?
Well, I think it's more inclined, obviously, towards those that sell a product, but I think the potential bigger opportunity is those that sell a service because it's going to be so atypical probably for quite some time. I mean, if you look at really what's happening with e-commerce and B2B, it starts with the most fundamental shift in buying we've seen in the last decade, which is 33% of all buyers today say they would prefer to have a seller-free sales experience. For millennials, that number is 44%. So we're getting close to where half of our buyers are saying, yeah, I don't really want to talk to a salesperson. Now, you can accept that or not as a company, but what's interesting is the marketplace doesn't really care about our opinions, does it, Dan? Right? It's just going to do what it does. And we've seen further studies on this that there's a total misconception of how much money B2B buyers will spend without talking to a salesperson because the numbers are phenomenal. 35% of B2B buyers say they would absolutely spend over $500,000 without talking to a person. If you are world class with your content and your experience, they don't really need any more because you've addressed every concern, every question, every doubt that they're thinking. This is what's possible for the companies that get it. And so this is why also, if a company starts from a place of, okay, so if we did want to do some type of e-commerce, and the way I'm going to define e-commerce for this conversation is the ability to make the transaction for the product or service online without talking to a human. Okay, that's how I'm going to define it for this conversation. And the reality is, if a company lives in a place of, okay, so let's start from, is it possible? Not, there's no way we could do this because that's easy and it's lazy. It's so lazy and uncreative, right? But the person that's coming from the place of, okay, nobody's doing this. Great, awesome. That means there's opportunity. So if we did do this, how could we do it? And that's where creativity and innovation start to collide together. And you see somebody that's in the B2B space that's now offering a product or service online as a straight e-commerce play that we've never seen anybody else do.
Perhaps you could just expand for me on some of the benefits of doing that, particularly in a space where maybe it's not perceived as really the done way currently.
Well, you have to say, do I want to meet my buyers, my potential customers, where they are, or do I expect them to meet me where I am? And that sounds easier said than done. Most B2B sales processes are hard-headed and do not want to change. And so they're asking the buyer to meet me where I am. And that is the ultimate recipe for failure today. Whereas if we say, okay, how can I meet them where they are? Well, I understand on certain things there's no way that we might be able to transact that. But are there elements that we could do on our website first? Let me give you an example of something that is what I would consider e-commerce-ish, but it's not even a straight purchase. And what I mean by that is the precursor to great e-commerce is replicating the traditional sales process with tools on your website that are essentially interactive with a buyer. So let's take my agency as an example. All right. Like I've got a lot of things that I'm cooking up, a lot of things that I'm thinking about that we're in the process of doing. There's an order of, let's say, operations that every B2B should be doing, especially if you're a service-based B2B. Number one, you need to be talking about cost and price and teaching about cost and price well on your website right now. In other words, what drives cost up for that product or service? What drives cost down? Why are some companies so expensive? Why are some companies so cheap? And roughly, where do you fall? Those are the five elements of a really strong educational cost article or video or whatever the thing is. Now, everybody should do that as the minimum standard in the B2B space, especially service. Okay, again, especially service. That's the minimum standard. Now, I'm not going to debate on that because people can sit there and try to debate me on it. They're going to lose because I've got all the data, and those that want to debate don't have the data. Look, I wrote the book They Ask You Answer. I was the first person to really, really start teaching companies in the world how to talk about cost and price on their website, B2B, B2C, business to government, service product. It doesn't matter. I've got all the data behind it. The buyers want it. The companies that understand how to do it appropriately and effectively, they crush it, especially when others in your industry aren't talking about cost and price. So, level one is you talk about, educate cost and price of your product or service on your website. Level two is when you come up with assessment tools that traditionally would have been a conversation with a salesperson that now can be done through a tool. So let me give you an example. Example of this would be with my agency. We're a HubSpot partner, right? So businesses come to us and they want to do some type of content campaign, or they want to use some type of marketing automation or CRM. And one of the tools that they come to us looking for is potentially HubSpot, right? If I'm smart, I say, okay, one of the questions everybody's going to ask us is, so what level of HubSpot should I be using? What tier? Okay. In the past, they had to talk to a salesperson to get that information. Salesperson's going to ask you a couple questions, and based on the answers, they're going to say, okay, well, based on what you've just told me, I think you should get the professional level of HubSpot. Well, can we replicate that on our website? Well, of course we can. So, in other words, if I created a tool on my website, a self-service slash self-selection tool that says, what's the best level or tier of HubSpot for me? Question mark. And then you get to interact with the tool, and the tool says, okay, so which of the following things would you like to be able to do with HubSpot, right? And you check the boxes, and it says how many total employees, check the boxes, and it says, are you looking for the sales side of this, or the sales and marketing side, or the sales marketing customer service side, right? And so it's like you can start checking the boxes just like I would ask you in person. I'm now asking you with a simple interactive tool on my website. And then at the end of this experience, and it can't be too overwhelming with questions, but the end of the questions, let's say it's 10 questions or so, you say, okay, so based on what you've just explained to me, it sounds like your best fit is such and such HubSpot level. So that's the next level up. I've now made a recommendation to you that normally in the past you would have had to call me for. I've made the recommendation without you talking to a human. Very, very powerful. That's level two. Level three. Now you do that same thing, but you give pricing with it, some type of pricing calculator. Now, this can be done in any industry. I have a manufacturing company. So I manufacture fiberglass pool shells. I sell them to pool builders around the country, and then they install them in the ground for homeowners. So it's a B2B to C operation that I have as a manufacturer, right? So can I put a calculator, a pricing calculator on my manufacturing website, even though I don't set the end prices? Heck yeah, I can. Does anybody do it in manufacturing? Heck no, they don't. Why? Because they like to make excuses like, we don't set the end pricing. That's really dumb and naive. And so instead of doing that, say, okay, again, how's it possible to do this? So the way we do it is we give you a price range. So we let you choose the pool shape and all the features with your pool. And by the end of it, we're able to say, okay, Dan, based on what you just told me, it looks like you're going to spend somewhere around, 80 to 100,000 pounds on your in-ground swimming pool. And you're able to say, okay, I'm in the ballpark or I'm not. And then you can move forward. You might say, hey, at that point, I want to get an actual quote. The point is, The point is, I've given you more than every manufacturer out there. That's all e-commerce. Now, the one thing I can't do as a manufacturer yet is I can't allow you to actually buy it yet because of my dealers. But is there a place where eventually my dealers will be able to allow that? I think to a certain degree, yes. Um, there's always going to be a site visit first to see what other hidden costs there are, which we need to understand. But when we start thinking in terms of what's possible, it's amazing what we can do. So, like in the swimming pool industry, I've been first over and over and over again on doing the things that buyers want that nobody else is willing to do, and that's why we became a multi-million-dollar company and the fastest growing in the world. Blah blah blah, right? And I see in other industries that we've implemented they ask you answer with. And so a little bit of a long-winded answer, but those are the different levels of how you can do it. But finally, the final level is to allow the actual transaction. Those are the 5 levels of e-commerce right there.
That's awesome. Is there sometimes a bit of an organizational structure barrier whereby in a lot of B2B organizations, sales will have maybe historically led marketing or more likely to have a seat at the table strategically? And I guess the way that these organizations may have historically been set up, sales will often be comprised of lots of human beings and having kind of individual conversations, whether that's over the phone or going out and meeting people face to face. And therefore, they don't necessarily have a vested interest in shifting towards more of a kind of digital engagement sort of setup strategy. Is there ever a kind of an element of that where it's maybe not what you're describing is not necessarily aligned with the perceived interests of some of those within the organization?
Perceived, of course, they're worried that their jobs are going to get replaced by what is essentially AI on a website. So yeah, that's a big concern. Also naive. So why is it naive? And because what happens when companies do these types of self-service tools on a website, they get dramatically more leads. I have to hire way more salespeople because I get way more leads. Yet my salespeople have an easier job than everybody else that sells in our industry because our leads are dramatically more qualified. It's the biggest no brainer in the history of Earth. Yet, people still make excuses as to why it can't happen, why it can't be done, because it's never been done this way. I mean, you want to get replaced in your industry? Start using the phrase often, it's never been done this way.
So differentiation is obviously all about, looking at what the market's doing and going the other way. And I guess therefore there's probably no better time to do it than when nobody else is doing it. And maybe in 10 years, if everybody was doing it, there could be, counterintuitively a stronger argument for maybe doing it in a slightly more manual, human-centered way. But if you're in a market where everybody is currently depending entirely on human interaction, then actually containing the experience to more of a digital dimension, I guess, enables you to really position yourself in a very distinct place.
Well, yeah, the thing about it is, if you're doing this now, you're going to be dramatically more evolved past everybody else when everybody else catches up. I mean, Dan, it is. I'm just like, let's look again, let's go back to my manufacturing company. I have written books teaching my competitors how to be dramatically more successful, and I've showed them the blueprint. And do you think they followed it? No. Because you can take a horse to water, you can shove its face in the water, and you still can't make it drink. And this is the story of humanity here. And that's because the leaders of previous generations are the slowest to adapt the changes of the next generation. We see it over and over again, right? And so, I'm just amazed by it. So, yeah, eventually they're going to start doing what I'm doing. But by that point, I'm going to be way ahead still again, because I'm going to be doing something even more just immersive, even more informative. Now, will salespeople eventually get replaced? Yeah, maybe so. Maybe the way we define sales is going to be dramatically different in 30 years because everything is so digital, and there's just it could well get to that place, but today's not that day. The companies that are doing these types of things right now, their sales teams are busier than anybody else.
Just playing devil's advocate, and then I'll move on to some slightly different questions. But just finally on this, maybe rather than it being a kind of endless shift towards ever more digital. I wonder if it's actually about a blend.
I don't agree. I'm going to tell you right now. What you're doing is you're assuming that digital doesn't mean human. And that's an error of thinking. You have to say, as we become more digital, we're going to find better ways to become more human, not less. And the same things happen over the course of COVID. Now, I mean, I've trained a lot of sales teams on virtual sales practices, a lot, especially since the beginning of COVID. Certain sales teams have said we have more of a human to human relationship than we've ever had, even though we're no longer traveling to see them. Others have said we have less of a human to human relationship than we've ever had. So, what's the difference between the two? Some of them are using the tools appropriately, some of them are not. So, for example, if you and I, Dan, do a Zoom call 4 times this year, and it's a 30-minute Zoom call, and I see your face, and we have this fun conversation, and we do it 4 times this year, and we really just enjoy ourselves. Or I might see you in person 1 time next year. Which one leads to a better relationship? Well, that's the debate. I'm not going to say which one, but I've seen that happen a whole lot where the person that now gets 4 face to face, because we're having a face, even though the listeners can't see this, you and I are having a face to face experience right now. So this is not something that was available to us before. This is available to us now. So this is extremely digital what we're doing, yet we are building a human to human, face to face relationship as we're having this conversation. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive. They are if somebody is not seeing what's possible.
So I guess the point that and look, you're the one armed with all the data. I don't doubt you will enjoy tearing it apart at your leisure.
I want to enjoy it. I want to enjoy it.
um, but I did an interview a year or two ago with a chap called Rory Sutherland. I don't know if you know Rory. And one of his big topics, which I find fascinating, is this thing around costly signaling and how actually in a digital sphere you can potentially strip away some of the meaning and impact precisely because of its efficiency and scalability. On the other hand, and the lovely example that he used was wedding invitations, right? So wedding invitations are an unnecessarily fussy way of conveying an invitation to an event, but it's precisely in the unnecessary fussiness of it that we communicate the meaning and the impact. So let's imagine that you and I did only meet once, but it was in person and I had to fly halfway around the world in order to facilitate that. Precisely for those reasons, I'm probably going to attach a significance, a meaning to that encounter that I may not when it's just done with the convenience of Zoom. And that's why I wonder if there is this kind of like this high.
I don't disagree with that at all. I think that's absolutely true. And let me say, even though I'm a big believer that we're going to a place where we can have unbelievable face to face, even human experiences over digital realms and mediums, it doesn't take away skin to skin, nose to nose. And it's okay for someone to feel like they can coexist. I don't though believe that technology dehumanizes. I think it's the way we use technology that dehumanizes the thing. And unfortunately, most people use technology wrong. Now, when it comes to the metaverse, I could change my opinion. In other words, I might end up saying about metaverse, there's nothing net positive about the dang thing, and I hate it. And I could see myself saying that. Uh, with that being said, I do think that there's augmented and virtual reality usages in the sales process to help buyers and consumers make much more informed decisions that are based on trust and the ability to thoroughly vet whatever decision they're trying to make and whatever brand they're trying to consider in that moment, right? So, I'm with you in that there's power in investment, right? When you invest yourself in the experience and you give all yourself to it, it's no different than I own a charter fishing company. I've got really weird, diverse businesses. So um, one of these days somebody's going to say, you could experience that through Web3, and I could go to the metaverse and experience that. Yeah, to hell with that, you can, because there's nothing like catching a monster tuna on your own rod with your own sweat with real salt water that you're looking at. It's not replaceable. People will act like it is, that do the fake thing, but it's never going to be like the real thing. And I think there's always going to be a market for the real thing. It's just going to be groups of people that convince themselves otherwise. But let me just say again, if you said, what's perfect look like? Perfect looks like, to me, like I'm using technology for you and I to develop a stronger human to human personal relationship, while at the same time looking for opportunities to have those special one-on-one moments in real life.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, as a rule, the consumer space is generally a pretty good indicator for where the B2B space is likely to arrive at 5 or 10 years later. And I guess e-commerce is an example of that, right? Like we wouldn't be having this debate about whether or not you could sell consumer stuff in an e-commerce context. I wonder, are there other ways in which,
I think that 10-year gap's getting smaller, because I think more companies are thinking more like D2C, more B2B to C. I think there's more of a shift that's happening that few are talking about. I do believe it's about 10 years right now, but I think that gap's going to close with time.
yeah,
They'll be
no,
forced
I
to.
think you're right. Yeah, I think you're right. I just wonder, are there other ways? So e-commerce is one example of it. Are there other areas in which B2B should be learning from consumer today and not doing it in 10 years, but actually maybe kind of embracing some of the consumer principles today?
Oh, I think most of the ones that are working really well in that B2C space could absolutely directly be applied to business. And we've really hit on some of the majors that I'm a firm believer in. I mean, I think you've got to be a prolific teacher on your website and answer all the questions, and stop pretending that you should save questions for the sales process. That's a really dumb, naive move, considering that the majority of buyers in the B2B space are roughly 80% through the buying cycle before they reach out to the company. I mean, they pretty much know what they want because they've vetted so much, right? So you've got to become the Wikipedia of your space, period. And you should have an incredible learning center on your website that addresses all the questions, worries, fears, issues, concerns through text, through video about all the products and services you sell. And that's a full time thing for a marketing department to do. You should have a full time content writer if you can, if not many. You should have a full time videographer in house, if not many. And people listening to this right now saying, there's no way I could afford that. It's funny. I mean, you got 7 people and you're telling me there's no way you could afford a videographer on your staff, right? 7 salespeople, you've got no videographer. You get one videographer, and that's going to make the job of your sales team so much easier, and they're going to be so much more effective that you could probably have 5 salespeople and get done the same thing you're doing with 7. So,
Well, let's do that quickly. So let's imagine we've got this fictitious team of six or let's say seven sales and marketing people. What would that be comprised of? I know we're going to generalize here because obviously every industry would be a bit different. But like, what might those 7 people be comprised of if you were building that team from scratch?
So if I was building a team from scratch and I was looking at business from a generic standpoint, to your point of not being industry to industry here, I would say that you've got a head of marketing, and that head of marketing is really focused on leading the strategy and managing their team, and they're also the one that's most involved with the analytics. And that head of marketing is paying attention to measuring the ROI, using a tool like HubSpot and making sure the activities are producing fruit for the sales team, and is a liaison to the sales team. Now, that person's ahead of 2 people, which is the uh, lead content writer for the company, who's producing at least 3 educational articles a week that is going on the company website within that company learning center on the website. You got a videographer that's producing at least 2 educational videos per week, and those 2 people are meeting with the sales team often. Now, the sales team is comprised of one head of sales that's obviously just managing the team, and then you've got three main salespeople. So that's what you've got. You've got seven right there, and that's the perfect, like that's what perfect looks like today. And very, very few companies are going to do that. If you're lucky, you're going to see a 7-to-1 ratio where you have seven salespeople to one person in marketing.
Sounds like a pretty solid team to me. Yeah, yeah. No, that's awesome. Just moving on to, I mean, you just mentioned analytics briefly there. If you were to kind of narrow it down, because of course the big challenge with analytics is knowing what to focus on, right, and not getting sort of caught up in analysis paralysis. What if you were to narrow it down to three digital metrics? Quite a difficult thing to do this, but that a B2B organization should really laser in on a regular basis. It might delve into the broader data, maybe monthly, quarterly, but three metrics for it to obsess over on, let's say, a kind of weekly basis, what might those three KPIs be?
Well, the one that I am pretty obsessive about is what would be considered profit per piece of content. And so let me give an example. So I wrote with my swimming pool company. I was the first. We were the first company that ever produced a cost article because we use tools like HubSpot. I can track how many leads came to the website originally through that article. Okay. Now, those leads that filled out a form, that got an appointment, that bought, I know the value of each one of their sales. And so, therefore, I can put a total value on top of that one original cost piece that I wrote in 2009. It's 14 years old, that piece of content, 13 years old. And I can tell you without equivocation that it's made at a minimum $25 million in sales. $25 million I wouldn't have had I not addressed cost and price on the website. Right? That's that from that one. These are leads that originally landed on that piece of content. So attribution per page or per piece of content is a really big deal to me, and that's one that I obsess about all the time.
Is there a, so just to interrupt very quickly, is there a danger though that, and it might be that this is now covered by some of the other metrics you mentioned, that by like making it all about direct attribution, that because I guess different pieces of content, one might argue, could serve different roles at different stages in the buyer journey. Is there a danger that if we obsess over the kind of the sort of the directly revenue generation, that we might miss broader considerations?
I like the question. I think with anything, we have to make sure we see the forest through the trees, right? We can't be too latched on to one thing or another. But I think too often marketers actually use what you just said as an excuse for underperforming content. And they like to justify it. Oh, this is the full cycle here. It was blah, blah, blah. I'm like, yeah, but it hadn't produced jack squat. Can't
Yeah.
argue with the actual numbers, right? So the revenue per piece of content, that's probably my number one by far. Number two metric that companies don't pay attention to that I'm pretty obsessed with is the average page views per customer versus average page views per lead that doesn't turn into a customer. So let me give you an example of how this, like a discovery I made in 2014. I was looking at two groups of people on my website. This is my pool company here. Both groups had filled out a form. First group filled out a form and bought a pool. Second group filled out a form and didn't buy a pool. And the form was get a quote on a pool. Okay. So I said, what is the difference from a behavioral perspective from the ones that did buy versus the ones that just dipped their toes in the water but didn't buy? And what I kept seeing was the number 30. And this number 30 represented total pages viewed. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Damn. We found that if somebody read 30 or more pages of the website before the initial sales appointment, they would buy 80% of the time. If they didn't hit that magic number 30, closing rates are around 25%. So once they hit 30, there was like a literal hockey stick growth that occurred and closing rates exploded. And so I said, oh my gosh. And so we designed an entire sales process around that. And that's where I came up with the innovation that's called assignment selling. And if somebody's listening to this, they can Google it right now and you can learn all about assignment selling. But the point is, we have to be intentional with our content in the sales process. Most sales teams are not. They haven't been taught how to do it. In fact, they're not even informed as to what content's available to them to use. It's prolific in B2B, by the way. And so we want to eliminate that, but it starts with the why. And the why is that when they hit that tipping point threshold, man, that closing rate just goes through the roof. So the comparison between content consumption, page views per customer versus page views per lead is incredibly telling. 99% of the people listening to this right now couldn't tell me the difference between the two.
No, and how much data do you need in order to start drawing those conclusions? Like, is it from a kind of statistic dependability perspective? Is it worthwhile doing even fairly? Because obviously, a lot of B2B organizations, if they're selling a particularly high value product or service, they may not necessarily feel like they have sufficient data to work with in that respect. Or do you feel like actually you can draw some pretty meaningful conclusions?
They should have a lot more data. If they're working with a high value product, they should have a lot more data. You take a swimming pool, right? Could be easily 100,000 pounds. And so, I mean, really, like we find that the amount of content somebody will consume online correlates really on one sole factor. And it's actually not how much it costs as much as it is the fear of making the wrong decision. And so, in other words, if somebody's got a ton of money, they might not actually care about they might not put as much time into it. But if they feel like, "Oh, I could screw this up," or if I'm wrong, my boss is going to be pissed. That's when they start to go like on overdrive with how much they'll actually consume of content, right? And so that's what we find over and over again. And so what's interesting about that is, you could be buying something for a loved one that's less than, 50 pounds. And because it's such a big deal, like this gift you're getting for a loved one, they've done the studies on this. Like there's people that will spend and view 100 different pages online just to make sure they chose the right gift. You don't even realize what you're doing, but you just spent 3 hours for something that cost you 50 pounds, but it's because sentimentally it mattered to you. Whereas you went out looking for TVs, you didn't do a lot of research, you just went to your, local Walmart or whatever, and you just picked up the one on the shelf that was available to you because you knew you wanted some whatever flat screen. Now I'm not saying it's going to be like that, but this is what we see. Now that being said, the more expensive it is, the more the average page views do go up. But it's not always like that. Not always like that. For example, cell phone research is extremely high because we value cell phones and we don't want to screw up our choice. But yet, they're only $1,000 or whatever.
That's fascinating. Really, really interesting. That's probably the most, I don't want to say unusual, but like distinctive answer I've ever had to a question of that nature. A couple of those metrics are just so different. It's fascinating, but makes so much sense.
Yeah, I'm a,
So much
I'm a
sense.
different dude, brother.
Certainly, I know it's awesome. It's awesome. I love it. Um, so just finally, then, so you talk quite a bit about the importance of like the power of honesty and transparency within content. I wonder, are you seeing? Have you seen a bit of a shift since the pandemic? Are you seeing greater adoption of that mindset? Because it feels to me like quite a lot has changed culturally following the pandemic, or is
Oh,
or is
yeah.
or are a lot of B2B brands still really kind of struggling with that?
Oh, certainly. There's still going to be your group that's, looking at the water, not drinking, even though more than ever they know they should. Reality, though, did sink in for a lot of B2Bs over these last 2 years, right? Yeah, I mean, it's just like whether it was e-commerce or whether it was, I'll never forget it. This financial wellness CEO, he's got a big financial wellness company. He reached out to me like 6 months after COVID started, and he said, "Well, my team has finally realized that we don't have to use a golf course to close deals." And I thought that just about summed up the entire B2B experience, right? Because this is a man that thought, and his sales team thought that all the deals had to be done on a golf course or something similar. And suddenly, they're closing multi-million-dollar deals on freaking Zoom calls, right? It's like, how does that happen? Well, we understand how it happens, especially when the companies do it the right way. And so, another thing that I'm seeing, and I'm going to write about this today, in fact, on LinkedIn. Which, by the way, if you're listening to this, and you're not following me on LinkedIn, you're missing out, because that's where, from a social media perspective, that's where I live. That's where my best stuff is. Um, I want to post about this today because what I'm seeing is more and more companies debate on LinkedIn, because I get roped into these because everybody knows me as the guy that talks about being able to discuss cost and price on your website. Which, by the way, we haven't talked deeply into the how today, but there's clear ways to do this effectively, regardless of what you sell. I've done some examples today, but there's a million different routes to success when it comes to discussing cost and price on your website. But I'm seeing way more debates about this online. So whereas before it wasn't as much of a debate, what you're now seeing is people in the industry saying, you know what, I really think I need to do this. What's funny about this, though, Dan, is our gut is telling each one of us, you probably should. I mean, that's what you would want if you were the buyer. Eventually, we're going to have to accept the golden rule actually works. And that, hey, if we would like the seller to do that for us, well, then we would probably like it, or our customers would probably like it if we did it for them. Right? And that's where we're headed. So everybody is having this internal civil war, if you will, right now, as to what their conscience says. Like, yeah, ding dong, you should do this. You would want them to do this. Versus, no, that's not the way we've done it. And we have a very customized solution, right? These are the stories that we're telling ourselves. And we've got, a voice on each shoulder that is trying to convince us. But I can tell you who wins? The marketplace always wins. Always wins. I've never seen a situation where the marketplace didn't win. It made me laugh my tail off the other day. I was looking at this thing, and it was an article, and it said, Uber reaches agreement with New York City taxis. 10 years ago, the taxi companies were it was like nuclear war with Uber. Uber was the devil incarnate. Now all of a sudden, they're in bed with Uber. Why? The marketplace has spoken. The marketplace wins. And eventually, you have to adjust your business model accordingly.
You certainly do, and it certainly does. You are absolutely correct. Look, Marcus, I've absolutely loved this. As I say, it's actually really challenged a few of my preconceptions. I'm a little bit concerned about what you said about the golf course, because that is currently it's my only opportunity to get on the golf course, is to basically wrap it up in a sort of business disguise. So a little bit concerned about that, but the rest of it, I'm fully on board with.
No, you keep doing your thing. Especially, you got a chance to go out there and play at St. Andrews, so you keep doing your thing, brother.
I certainly will. Look, really, really appreciate it. I've absolutely loved it, Marcus. Thank you so, so much.